And I'd like to welcome back Roy Hunt. Thank you. Good morning.
Well, thank you for being here. Today we will, I hope, complete Jefferson's 5 years in Paris. Can you hear me all right? When we ended last week, we had been to the convent school where Jefferson's two daughters were until the elder one wrote him and said she wanted to become a nun, and he very quickly withdrew her, both daughters, and had them homeschooled, which is what Abigail Adams thought should have been done all along. We talked about the Gabriel facades and talked quite a bit about the Hotel de Somme. Both of those were considered good models for buildings in the new federal city. And of course, the Hotel de Somme was also considered a good choice, both for his own home, Monticello II, as well as for the new federal city, both the front facades and the rear facade. So today we want to talk about other buildings. Again, these are all buildings that can still be visited in Paris or in Provence that he thought were suitable for the new city. And as I think I mentioned, when Pierre L'Enfant was picked as the planner for the federal city, he thrust upon him, I think, 25 different buildings that he should consider for the new federal city. The others that we want to talk about today, the Louvre, and particularly the East Colonnade, the Palais Royal, the Hall of Bled, or now the Hotel de Commerce, the Pantheon, and a couple of toll houses, which you will find it hard to believe were simply toll houses, La Villette and the Barrière Chartres on the edge of the Parc Monceau. All of these buildings were within walking distance of Jefferson's Hotel de Langeac, and we discovered last week he numbered every step. And some of, or I should say, since my very first visit to the Louvre in 1952 as a naval midshipman, and if you ever read Art Buchwald's The 15-Minute Louvre, and if you haven't, you should look it up. I mean, it's 40 or 50 years old. Column, but that's basically what I did in 1952. You know, you had to do the Winged Victory, Venus de Milo, and Da Vinci's portrait. And incidentally, in those days, it was simply on an easel and you could walk right up and touch it. In any event, since that time, 1952, I visited the Louvre at least a dozen times. But I've always approached it from the West End or the Arc de Carousel. And it was, let's see. Yeah, okay. No. Next one. There. But it, what do I do to get that out of the middle? Oh, okay. I made this photo, I'm not sure when, but obviously after I.M. Pei's pyramid was completed. But again, I had always approached it from this direction, and I think most tourist visitors do. And beginning in 1984, this was a construction zone while Pei's glass pyramid was being constructed. This was completed in 1988. It was highly controversial during the construction. I think it's now considered an architectural triumph. And I think this is one of my best photographs. Somehow I managed to get that wild sky in the background, and there was sun coming in on one wing. Again, in all those years from 1952 to 2022, I had never paid any attention to the East Colonnade. Again, that's not the way I approached it, or most approach it. So hidden from me in plain sight was the Louvre's long facade and its grand colonnade or colonnade. The Louvre was, as we know it today, was a project that went on for 800 years. And while the Louvre today is in the very center of Paris, until the 18th century, it was actually at the city's western edge. In 1662, Louis XIV decided the Louvre should have a grander facade facing what was then the center of Paris, which was on the Ile de la Cité. And he summoned from Rome Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the great master of the Italian Baroque, known best as an architect for his colonnade at the Vatican. No, I'm not. It's not going forward. Well, I'll try going back, see what happens. Nothing. I guess this is a good photograph to be stuck on. I'm helpless. I think Debbie went to find the person without whom my lectures can't go forward. Anyway, I could talk a little bit about it while we're trying to get photographs of it. To describe this, as I say, as Louis XIV's project, the irony is that after he got it built, and they moved all the business, most of the business, or at least his headquarters, out to Versailles. But again, he summoned Bernini from Rome, and at that point, he had done the design for the famous colonnade at the Vatican. I think he'd done the design, but it was only now that they were beginning it. Okay. Thank you. He was better known, although he was well known as a sculptor. He was even better known. But this is a very familiar site to you, I'm sure. So this is referred to as Bernini's colonnade or colonnade at the Vatican. Now I think I want to back up to the, yeah. This is the east facade or the east front of the Louvre. And I doubt that any, or at least many of you have ever entered that way. It's the length of 2 NFL football fields if you exclude the end zone. So it's almost exactly 600 feet long, and very impressive. And as I said, Louis XIV brought probably the most famous Baroque architect of the time to do something about a new facade. Well, Bernini recommended demolishing the whole Louvre and starting over. And actually, demolition began, but it was suspended after a year because Louis XIV really did not like Italian Baroque. And in fact, Italian Baroque did not come to Paris until after Louis XIV's death. And after dismissing Bernini, Louis appointed a council of 4 French architects to come up with a new design. And the construction that Jefferson saw was this particular construction. The design, which is a study in unity, has, again, a 600-foot-long facade, which follows the 5-part pattern of French palaces of that particular time, with 2 pavilions, one at each end, and a central entrance topped with a pediment. And only the pediment breaks the strict horizontality of the roof line. The roof line is softened a bit with a balustrade. The end pavilions recall Roman triumphal arches. And at the time, the raised Corinthian columns were quite startling. They were startling because of their pairing. This was simply not done under Vitruvius or the early Roman builders. You never separated columns in that fashion. They were always equidistant from each other, and there was a formula for the distance, the equidistance based on the order, Doric or Ionic or Corinthian. So the 4 French architects who designed the facade claimed their result was a new type appropriate to modern French taste. And Jefferson agreed, and we will later see his use of 40 paired columns in the dome room at the University of Virginia's Rotunda at the head of the lawn. Well, the departure from Vitruvian guidelines was adopted very soon in England by James Gibbs. Those are the paired columns again on the facade of the Louvre. You can see the Corinthian capitals, the fluting. But this is something that'll be very familiar to you from watching Masterpiece Theater. This is the Radcliffe camera, which is part of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And you see the paired columns here, which spring from the band all the way around. Again, James Gibbs, who was a major disciple of Palladio, and this was done in 1748. Well, closer to Jefferson's Hotel, well, first let me, this is the west facade, the west front, I think they call it, of the U.S. Capitol. And the central portion, the original portion of the Capitol, which was designed by Dr. William Thornton, had these same paired columns, double columns, as you see in the center. And this is original, even though the columns have been replaced. They were originally sandstone, and that didn't hold up well. But it's precisely the design which was original to the west front. As time went on, wings were added, and of course, it's been a constant scene of construction ever since it was built. But here is the same thing at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. And although this does not have the paired columns, we see that into the 1930s and 40s, this influence, see the dome there of the Hotel de Somme, this influence continued. This is the National Gallery of Art. Old timers call it the Mellon Gallery. This is an interior, one of the interiors there. And here is the Jefferson Memorial. And these buildings were both designed by same person, an architect from New York City. And his name has just left me suddenly. In any event, he did these, well, in fact, the Jefferson Memorial began in 1939, was completed during World War II. The Mellon Gallery was, I think, 1937 or 1939. And then lo and behold, here in North Florida, on the Georgia-Florida border, we have a house that he designed in 1937. It's called the Dixie Plantation House, which is politically incorrect, I'm sure now. And it's now under the stewardship of Tall Timbers, a conservation group dedicated to saving the red hills of North Florida and South Georgia. Again, Doric columns here, but certainly influenced by Jefferson's years in France. Well, near the Hotel de Langeac, Jefferson's home in Paris, which, as I mentioned last week, he had leased for 3 years with an option to continue up to 9 years. And this was a remarkable new development in Paris. And in fact, Jefferson and his daughter, Patsy, spent their first few nights in Paris in an inn just on the left side of the photograph you're looking at on the Rue de Richelieu. And this is called the Palais Royal. It's located opposite the Louvre, north side. It's now owned by the French state. The French Ministry of Culture is housed over to the right there. There are various governmental agencies there, but also there are private enterprises here as well. And at the time, this was the heart of Cardinal Richelieu's old palace. You may recall the stories of Richelieu, but he served Louis XIII. And then subsequently, it housed various members of the royal d'Orléans family because Louis XIV had bestowed the title of Duke d'Orléans on his younger brother, Philippe, who passed it on to male descendants. And in 1776, the property passed to the then heir to that title. And the young Duke turned to real estate development or speculation, and he dreamed up this unprecedented extravaganza of development and debauchery. It was basically a shopping mall with a covered promenade around the perimeter of the large garden at the ground level. And above it were apartments, gambling dens, brothels, cafes, and private clubs. And the apartments were actually entered from the surrounding streets, so they were not entered from the center here. Well, the new Palais Royal opened for business in 1784, contemporaneously with Jefferson's arrival in Paris. And Jefferson soon joined in the fun. He joined the fashionable club, the Salon des Échecs, above the Café de Foix. Jefferson was so impressed with the financial possibilities in this novel urban mall that he briefly considered promoting such a shopping mall in Richmond, the new Virginia capital. But for our purposes, it's the Palais Royal's architecture Jefferson promoted once he was back home, and again as models for the new capital city. And at the very go back one. At the very northern end, which would be to the left, no, to the right, there's a restaurant that Jefferson favored, Le Grand Béfour, and later Napoleon and Josephine favored. And remarkably, it's still functioning and one of the most expensive and elegant restaurants in Paris. Another restaurant Jefferson frequented, and I'm not showing photographs of that, is Le Percope. So again, you can have somewhat of the Jeffersonian experience still when it comes to dining. At the northern, let's see, I guess it would be the eastern nearby. Today, it's 2 blocks east, yes. 2 blocks east of the Palais Royal is another building Jefferson dreamed or deemed appropriate as a model for the new federal city. This was the circular Marché aux Bleds, B-L-E-D-S, today known as the Bourse de Commerce. Jefferson's first visit there was with Maria Cosway, and we may hear of later. And this was adjoining the, I can't remember how many buildings, but 3 or 4 rectangular buildings that made up Les Halles until it was demolished in 1971. Ironically, the replacement proved to be such a disaster, multi-storied mall, that it's been torn down, and there are new structures and more open space there as of today. But this circular structure, and incidentally, if you can see it, there's a standing column over to the right that is original to Dion, Marie de Medici's residence there. In any event, this was the grain market. It was originally constructed between 1763 and 1767. It was a place to store and negotiate the trade of grain. And it had an open air court. Indeed, there was a ramp, and you would drive your oxen pulling the grain right into that open area. But it had been roofed over by the time Jefferson and Maria went there in 1784. It was capped by an inverted glass bowl, its sections held together with wooden ribbed framing. And Jefferson was a bit given to hyperbole when he saw the buildings he liked, and he called this dome, quote, the most superb thing on earth, unquote. And in 1805, when Jefferson was president, he urged the new capital architect, Benjamin Latrobe, to model the ceiling of the House of Representatives on that of the Marche aux Bleds. Latrobe, who was concerned about leaks, justifiably, and you think about Frank Lloyd Wright, Latrobe refused to do that. But this building was re-roofed many times after Jefferson's visit, but it still stands. And after a remarkable intervention by the architect Tadao Ando, the Bourse du Commerce reopened in May 2021 as an exhibition space for pieces from Francois Pinault's 3,500 works of contemporary art. And in 2016, the mayor, this was owned by the city, the mayor of Paris leased it to Pinault for 15 million euros for 50 years, plus annual fees. And Pinault, this is the outside. To the right is the Bourse du Commerce. To the left are structures that were created to complement it, concave as opposed to convex. And the show that I saw when I was there in May featured the sculptor whose piece is outside the front entrance to the Bourse. Some of you may have visited Pinault's earlier adaptations in Venice. He had leased the Palazzo Grossi there, and then later the Punta della Dogana, and hired Tadao Ando to turn those into exhibition spaces. But for the purpose here in Paris, Ando placed a 50-foot concrete cylinder inside the circular building as the Bourse's main exhibition gallery. Then another building that caught Jefferson's eye and was suggested as a model was Soufflot's Church of Saint-Geneviève, which at the time Jefferson arrived was completed up to the base of the dome, and it was modeled after the Pantheon in Rome. After the Revolution, the new government transformed the church into a place to honor those who had died fighting for the Revolution and for the greatest French men. It was not until 1995 that a French woman made it into the Pantheon, when Marie Curie was entombed here. So the Church of Saint-Geneviève became the Pantheon, and indeed still is. It has some very interesting features. Jefferson's singled out, if I can find it here, La Villette. This is one of the two toll houses. There were a succession of walls around Paris, and the final one had 47 toll houses. The walls were not to keep enemies out. They were to make sure that anybody who came in bringing any import, I can't remember just how it's worded, but it includes just about everything, any product of the earth or the sea, had to go through one of these 47 toll houses and pay a fee. And this is the one that's at the very northern end of the Canal Saint-Martin over in the eastern part of Paris. You'll recognize the Palladian influence in the arches above. And it's thought that this was influenced by Palladio's Villa Rotonda near Vicenza. Again, remarkable for a toll house. There was a second toll house. I think there are only a few of the toll houses. They were all designed by Ledoux, and there are only a few that survive, but this is in the Parc Monceau. And again, you can see how this might have influenced Jefferson. I think it's called the Barrière Chartres. But the afternoon we were there were mobs in the park also. Then, see where I am in here. I have a lot of loose papers here, but lots of yellow tabs. Well, I didn't mean to leave Madame Recamier in, but there she is. And in 1785, soon after Jefferson got to Paris, he received a message from Madison, who was governor of Virginia at the time, asking for a model for the new capital in Richmond. And they wanted it ASAP. But at the same time, he was asked to commission a sculpture to go into the rotunda in the Capitol in Richmond. And clearly, Jefferson's favorite artist was a sculptor. Among the artists he met in Paris, the sculptor Houdon, Houdon. And so he negotiated with Houdon for a standing statue of Jefferson. And interestingly, when Benjamin Franklin left Paris after 7 years and 9 months after Jefferson arrived, he took with him the sculptor Houdon along with 2 of Houdon's assistants. And they actually spent weeks at Mount Vernon taking casts of almost every part of his body, including a face mask. Well, Washington declined to be shown as an emperor in a toga and insisted on modern dress, which is what we ended up with. But it's incredibly accurate because, again, Houdon had all of those casts he and his assistants had done at Mount Vernon. He actually got several commissions, but this was the main one, and this is in the dome of the Capitol in Richmond. And I made this photograph not too long ago, and I thought even the details on this were wonderful. It's based on the story of Cincinnatus, the Roman emperor, military leader, who once he was victorious and thought he was no longer needed, resigned and returned to his farm. So you can imagine that would have appealed to both Washington and Jefferson. Then Jefferson frequently had to visit Versailles. Let me back up. Frequently had to visit Versailles. We looked at a different photo last week, but this is the Hall of Mirrors, which is probably the most ornate of all the spaces. But Jefferson really hated Versailles. He thought that it was much too much. There's Thomas Jefferson again, speaking with someone in the Hall of Mirrors. But as I say, Jefferson did not suggest anything from Versailles as a model for the new federal city. And he was constantly fighting with L'Enfant over that. L'Enfant wanted a White House that was 6 times larger than the present White House, for example. And you may recall that after Jefferson was in power in the presidency, he donated all but 5 acres around the White House to become a public park so that no future president could build a palace there. I'm going to back up a moment. This is by an artist that I was not familiar with until this particular trip, Hubert Robert. And he's an artist who had visited the Roman ruins in Provence. And he had earlier spent 10 or 12 years in Rome, but then he started painting Roman ruins in France, again in Provence. And these are in the Louvre now. I think they all are. But Jefferson had a chance to see them there before he ever went to Provence himself. And this is the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. And it's the building we'll see that Jefferson took as the model for the Virginia State Capitol. Other paintings, this is the Pont de Garde, which you probably walked across. And this is at Glanum. And he was very much influenced by Piranesi's engravings and paintings. This is one of them. Okay. Now, in addition to having to travel by carriage out to Versailles, another very influential building, or actually complex of buildings, was called the Désert de Retz, R-E-T-Z. And I was totally unfamiliar with it until this trip. But it's an erotic theme park done by a wealthy man and begun about 20 years before Jefferson arrived in Paris. It has 28 different structures. And it's about, by bus, it's about 45 minutes from Paris. But Jefferson rented a horse and buggy and Maria Causeway, and he went off on a toot to see the Désert de Retz. And this is really the centerpiece of the Désert de Retz. And it's supposed to be the bottom broken off of a large column. And you saw those strange openings up near the top. Those are intentional because this is supposed to be in ruins. Well, Jefferson was very, very taken with the Désert de Retz, maybe because Maria Causeway was with him. But he said how grand the idea excited by the remains of such a column. And he said the spiral staircase, too, was beautiful. And indeed it is. And it's thought that the column's interior layout influenced the interior of the layout of the rotunda at the University of Virginia. Well, in late 1786, Jefferson sought and was granted permission by Congress to travel on his own dime to the south of France. His departure was delayed by 5 months as a result of a broken wrist, which did not heal well. It was an accident which occurred in the Tuileries. He and Maria were walking in the Tuileries, and he playfully tried to jump over a low fence and fell and broke his wrist. But he had been outside Paris once. John Adams, who had been sent to England as the first ambassador to Britain, asked him to come over and help him with some negotiations with Portugal, financial negotiations, and also to deal with the Barbary pirate issue. And he and John Adams were so frustrated with their lack of progress that they rented a horse and buggy and went to see gardens. They got as far north as Birmingham. But the most famous one is the one at Stowe. And here you see one of the several so-called Palladian bridges. And there are a pair of these temples on the grounds. And then I've forgotten whether this is the Temple of Peace or Wisdom or something like that. In any event, you see that most of these show up in Jefferson's work. But finally, he gets to Nîmes. And this is the be-all and end-all for him. And he absolutely was infatuated with it. And he wrote to his friend, Madame de Tessé, and I'm trying to find the quote. And I will. Let's see, it was on his journal for his trip to the south of France was incredible. I mean, it was daily entries. And so we have a great deal of information about where he went and when. And he wrote to Madame de Tessé after finally getting to the Maison Carrée, "Here I am, madam, gazing whole hours at the Maison Carrée like a lover at his mistress." Well, he also declared it the most perfect and precious remain of antiquity. And he stared so long that workmen thought him, quote, an hypochondriac Englishman about to write with a pistol the last chapter of his history. So you can see he's quite taken with the Maison Carrée. And besides the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, he details. And then across an open space from it, you can see the corner of the Maison Carrée to the left, and facing it across an open plaza is the building that Sir Norman Foster did 20 years ago, intended to complement it. The original town library had been there and burned, and so Sir Norman Foster won the competition to replace it, and this is the result. And it's up to you to determine whether it complements it or not. This was a model, and when Jefferson was asked to come up with that design for the new Capitol in Richmond and chose the Maison Carrée as the model, again, he had not seen it at that point, but it was very well illustrated in Palladio's four books of architecture. And he engaged a Paris architect, Clearaceau, to be the architect of record, and who actually drew the drawings. Again, Jefferson had not seen it for himself at that point. Again, he finally did, but even before that, it had been selected as the model for the Virginia State Capitol. And having experienced the difficulties with the building of Monticello I, he knew that workmen needed something very literal to refer to. They didn't have blueprints of the sort we have now. And so he and Clearaceau engaged the leading model maker of Paris at the time to do this model of plaster of Paris. It has some iron rods in it. It's quite spectacular on its own. And you can see it now in the Capitol in Richmond. It was an expensive project. And again, it was completed and sent to Richmond so that workmen could take a look at it whenever they needed to. Well, by June the 10th, Jefferson was, let me show you another. This was the arena, Roman arena in Nîmes. This was another Roman ruin in Nîmes. And if you take a look at what's over each window, you see that you've seen that thousands of times since in neoclassical buildings, alternating the triangular pediment and the rounded one. And then he did get to the Pont de Garde. And incidentally, the Pont de Garde was built to take water about 40 miles from, or this is the part of the works, from about 40 miles to Nîmes. So it was the water supply for Nîmes. This is at Glanum, Roman ruin. And then he got to Orange, which is just north of Avignon. And this is the Roman triumphal arch there, which is pretty spectacular. Well, besides the places that I've just shown, he gets back on June the 10th, just in time for Polly's arrival. And Polly and her companion, Sally Hemings, spent several days in London with Abigail and John Adams. And Abigail later expressed disapproval, that Jefferson had chosen Sally Hemings, who at the time was 14, to bring Polly to Europe. And she also was annoyed because he didn't come to London to meet them. He sent a functionary, a servant, not Sally's brother James, but someone else. Then upon Polly's arrival, she was immediately sent off to the convent where her older sister Patsy was. Well, in 1789, Congress granted Jefferson's request for a 6-month home leave. And so Jefferson and his party, which was comprised of Jefferson, the 2 daughters, James Hemings, and his sister, Sally Hemings, started their trip home just about 2 months after the fall of the Bastille. And Jefferson and his party were held up in Le Havre for a while by bad weather. But finally they made it home to Monticello. Now this was not the home at the time. They were still in Monticello 1. But soon, in 1794, I think, he demolished the first Monticello and began work on Monticello 2, which you see here, that was so influenced by the Hotel de Somme. And once home, Jefferson never returned to France. Again, he thought he was going to after 6 months. But when he got home, George Washington appointed him the first permanent Secretary of State. And that was the end of Paris. Now, after last week's lecture, I discovered that most of you were most interested in the relationship between Jefferson and Sally more than his architecture. And so I've done a little more research on it. It's something I heard a lot about. And in fact, 2 friends and I were at Monticello 2 weeks after they started interpreting the story to include Sally Hemings and the 6 children. In any event, there's a vast literature on the issue of Thomas Jefferson's relationship with, if any, with his slave, Sally Hemings. The controversy became public as early as 1802 when a disaffected former political ally of Jefferson's broke the story of Sally Hemings as Thomas Jefferson's concubine and the mother of a number of his children. He broke the story in a Virginia newspaper. And over time, Jefferson never responded to the accusation. His recognized white family, you recall he had 6 children, 2 of whom lived to adulthood, by wife Patty, Martha called Patty. And his recognized white family, the descendants of those 2, denied his paternity of Hemings' children, which is probably not surprising. And then in 1873, Madison Hemings, the third of the surviving 4 children, of the surviving 6 children, identified Jefferson as his father and that of all his siblings. There were 4 survivors. I think I just said 6, but there were 4. The first was male, named Beverly. The second was Harriet, female. And the third was Madison. And the fourth was Eston. Again, there were others who were stillborn or didn't survive. But it was Madison who in 1873 claimed that he was the son of Thomas Jefferson along with the siblings. Well, move forward a long time to 1998, and a DNA study published in the journal Nature established that a male birth, a male with a Jefferson Y chromosome, fathered Eston, the youngest surviving child of the relationship. And that led the Jefferson Foundation to appoint a committee of 9, 4 of whom had PhDs in history, to look into the matter. And in 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and that's the organization that owns Monticello, concluded that Thomas Jefferson was the father of Eston and likely the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children listed in the Monticello records. I think there were more than 6 births, but again, only 6 that lived long enough to make it into the records. Well, in 2001, the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society challenged the foundation conclusion, insisting that Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph, was the likely father. I have friends on both sides, and I'm sure that they will never come to a common conclusion. Some have wondered why James and Sally didn't simply remain in Paris, as there was a procedure, a routine procedure for petitioning for relief from slavery. Well, according to Madison, Sally, while still in Paris and pregnant with their first child, negotiated, and I always see that term negotiated in quotation marks, with Jefferson, a promise of, quote, extraordinary privileges, unquote, for herself, for returning to Monticello with him. Well, chief among these was freedom for her children upon their reaching their majority. And indeed, all 4 surviving children of Hemings and Jefferson were granted their freedom, either being allowed to leave Monticello with Jefferson's support or through his will. Sally, however, was never freed. And I think I'll just end there. I had enough material for another lecture, about Jefferson and architecture after he returned from Paris, but maybe we can make that a wonder next term if I'm still around. So anyway, I've really enjoyed this. I enjoyed the research enormously. It was great fun. And thank you for being here. Any questions?
Any questions here? Let me check on Zoom.
No questions.
No questions.
All right, you're free to go.
Thanks, Roy. Well, I'm going to look forward to part 3.